We're really pleased to have Ezra Vogel join us today from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Ezra is delivering today the annual Coughlin Lecture. So every year, the East Asia Center hosts a particularly prominent individual to deliver a lecture to us. And he was actually scheduled to deliver this in the spring, in April, when for reasons I think everybody understands, we had to cancel and postpone. So we're very pleased that he's come back to join us and deliver the remarks remotely to our audience. I have known Ezra since I was a postdoc at Harvard in the late 1980s. I don't know if he remembers me.
I do. Remember you were an excellent student. We enjoyed having you.
But we have gotten to know each other quite well over the last decade or 15 years as we've worked together on a program that mentors young Japan faculty and tries to convince scholars that have focused pretty much on their research and their writing to think about how they can share their ideas with the general public and with policymakers and produce some policy relevant work. And this program, it's called the Mansfield Program for Network for the US-Japan Network for the Future, is modeled on another program that Ezra started for young China scholars. And between these two programs, I'm guessing he's been on a couple of dozen study tours, taking hundreds of our up and coming Japan and China scholars to meet people in Washington, DC, and meet people in Beijing and Tokyo and other parts of the region. And it really shows his commitment to the role that can be played by scholars in increasing understanding between our countries. And I think everything that Ezra has written has come from that spirit that if we can just understand each other, we can get along a lot better. I think that informed his writing of the book that I think he's best known for on the Japanese side, and that is the book called Japan is Number One. It came out in the late 1970s. And it has also informed what he's been writing lately on books such as the biography of Deng Xiaoping that came out in 2011. And his new book on Japan and the United States, China and Japan. I don't know if this is going to show with the...
Yes, we can see it very well.
Okay. So this book is from 2019 and focuses on the very important bilateral relationship between Japan and China that he is going to talk about with us today. And we really appreciate him joining us to deliver these remarks.
Well, that's a wonderful introduction, Lynn. I am sorry I wasn't able to come to the University of Virginia. I've been there several times over the course of my career. And I remember my good friend John Israel, who taught at Virginia many years and was a graduate student when I was an overgraduate student here at Harvard. So Terry McDougall and Brantley Womack and others that I have seen over the years. And I love your campus and the idea of Thomas Jefferson and of the vision of faculty living upstairs and holding students downstairs. That vision still sticks with me, and I love your campus. And so I'm sorry I wasn't able to get there in person, although I must say, as an elderly person, I appreciate Zoom and not having to go through airport security. Another way of putting some of the things that Len was stating is that I started as a sociologist, and I started studying family, and I really got to know people. And I became very good friends with a lot of the Japanese I knew in 58, 59, 60. And then when I started working in China, I didn't get into China until 1973, but I have become good friends with a lot of Chinese too. So when I finished my book on Deng Xiaoping in 2010, put it another way, I retired from Harvard in 2000. I wanted to retire at a young age and give a chance for the bright young faculty to do the teaching. And I thought there was plenty of research that I could do. So for 10 years, I tried to write about what I thought was the biggest change that China has gone through in the last century, and the person who really put China on the path that made it so successful, and that's Deng Xiaoping. And so I spent 10 years studying that. When I got through, it was 2010. And at that point, China and Japan had a terrible relationship. They were really at each other's throats. There was a ship crash where a Chinese ship had banged into a Japanese ship and then banged into another one in 2010. And relationships were really awful. And so at that time, I thought I had a mission. You know, I was very lucky that I was able to write a book, Japan's #1, that became popular in Japan. And my book on Deng Xiaoping became popular in China. So I had the good fortune of being the unique person, good friends in both, and written a bestseller on Japan, published in Japan, a bestseller on China, published in China. There was nobody quite like that. So I had the mission that maybe I could help in trying to look at the relationship. I knew that if a Chinese wrote a book, the Japanese, would think, it's one-sided. If a Japanese wrote a book, then the Chinese would not quite believe it. And I felt, as one who really cared about both places and was known in both countries as somebody who cared, that if I could help write and understand these relationship between these two countries, it might help them form a better relationship. Now, as Len knows very well, I'm not a historian and don't have qualifications as a historian, but I decided that to write that book, I had to learn more about history. A lot of the Chinese were saying that time, the problem is the Japanese don't look at history. What I decided by the end of the research, I worked about 7 years studying the two countries and their relationship through history, was that it's true the Japanese don't know how to say I'm sorry quite enough. They haven't fully apologized for all the horrible things they did in China in World War II especially, but in some of the other times as well. But the Chinese also haven't learned to say thank you quite enough, because the Japanese contributed a lot. So by working on the history, I felt that I could get a kind of broad perspective of these two countries. And in looking at the history of the two countries, I could see that way back from 600 to 838 AD, Japanese learned a lot about China. All their basic civilization really came from China. Before they started sending people to China in 600, they didn't have a written language. They hadn't studied Buddhism, they hadn't studied Confucianism, they hadn't studied architecture, all these things they learned, and they sent missions to China from 600 to 838, almost 20 missions. And in those days, it was very hard to send, very risky for ships to go. They would send 3 or 4 ships at a time. But all the basics of philosophy, history, written language, literature, city planning, Kyoto and Nara, as Len knows well, were modeled after Changsha in China. So the culture really was very much influenced. But in the course of my study, I noticed there were 2 other times when China learned a lot from Japan. And that comes in the period I'm going to talk about. One of the things about looking at the grand sweep of history is you can see kind of broader patterns and broader relationships. And so the topic I've chosen for today is the period when Japan was on top. From 1895, after the Sino-Japanese War, until 2010, Japan had the upper hand in the relationship between the two countries. In long history, China, up until 1895, China was the great power, and Japan was a small power in the shadow of China. From 1895, Japan was really on top until 2010. Why is 2010 the year that I picked? I could have picked 2008 or 2012, or I could have made it that period. But around that time, several things happened. In 2008, China held the Olympics. And of course, Japan held the Olympics in 1964. And it was a great coming out party for Japan to show that they were a modern country. The same thing happened in Korea. And in 2008, China did the biggest Olympics that the world's ever seen. And it was a marvelous display that a country has really arrived. And so they had a great deal of pride. They had done a better Olympics than any country had ever done before. The other thing that happened in 2008 is it was a global financial crisis. And the West didn't look too good. The United States was in real trouble and barely sort of held the international financial community together. But China during that 2008 financial crisis was not hurt that bad. It did quite well. So a lot of Chinese began to feel that they could handle things pretty well and that they were pretty proud of what they had done. And they knew that every year, the size of the Chinese economy was gaining on Japan. In 2010, the World Bank declared the size of the Chinese economy had passed Japan's. So you could take that period of 2008, 2010. The reason I use 2010 is because that's the year the World Bank said that the Chinese economy passed out of Japan's. But it had begun to gain, and as I say, 2008, the Chinese felt very proud. 2012, there was another big incident, and in the Senkaku, what the Chinese call Yaoyudao and the Japanese call Senkaku, in those islands, there were some real problems. And in 2012, the Japanese declared that the nation bought the islands. It was a complicated story where a private owner who owned the territory in the island was supporting a Japanese politician that was very anti-Chinese, and the prime minister at the time, Kan Naoto, thought that if the nation took over the island, it'd be better. Well, to the Chinese, that was nationalization, and that created a great deal of fury in China. So from the period of 2010 to 2012, the relations were absolutely at a rock bottom, and they really hated each other. So after that time, basically China was on top. So I think of that period of 2008 to 2012 as a transition when China resumed the top spot, and the period of 1895, when the Sino-Japanese War took place, is the time when the Japanese took over. So let me just say a few words about the Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95, and then try to describe what I think are the big things that happened when Japan was on top. During the war, the Japanese, those little islands, they defeated China badly in land in Korea, and then in Manchuria, and in the ocean nearby. And it was an absolute shock to the Chinese. Some scholars have written about the period, said if you ask 1,000 Chinese and just before the war, what would happen if China and Japan would fight, they would have said, the 9,999 of them would have said, oh, we'll wipe them out immediately, that little pipsqueak of a place. We are the grand place. But here, those four little islands with a population much smaller than that of China, badly defeated the Chinese. And that came as an absolute shock. The Chinese talk in their history of the Opium War as kind of a turning point. They dominated, of course, the landmass in the Chinese territory until the Opium War. And then they lost out to the British and the French in wars in the 19th century. But those wars did not have nearly as big an impact on China as the war on Japan. This little pipsqueak of a place. Why did Japan, why were they able to defeat them? Well, beginning in the period after the Tokugawa, the Meiji period, the Japanese had studied Western organization, Western military technology. The Chinese had also acquired some good ships and so forth. So in terms of the actual equipment, military equipment, China was not too far behind. But what was really, or maybe even ahead, but the Japanese had organization, planning, skill, and they were ready to attack in a very organized way. But if there were a single factor that really made the Japanese win, I think it was information. The Chinese had been so proud and so arrogant that they didn't know much about Japan. They didn't care. It was a pipsqueak of a place, and why bother? But the Japanese, it's in the 1850s and 60s on up to the 1890s, was studying a lot about China. They saw commercial opportunities, and a lot of the merchants went to China. And the Japanese were very, very careful in their recording. They had detailed books of where merchants could go to buy things and sell things. And they had a several volume book on sort of Chinese geography for Japanese business people who wanted to go to China. So they knew the territory very well. The people who analyzed the Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95, said that even when they fought in Manchuria, the Japanese had in their pockets, the soldiers, maps of the area, and they were more familiar with that locality than the Chinese soldiers. They had just done their homework in learning about all the local areas and what to expect. And it isn't entirely clear how many of the people who were soldiers in 1894-95 on the Japanese side had been there as spies for the military, because a lot of them were engaged in business too. But a lot of the people who had been there as businessmen and were collecting information for businesses turned out to be soldiers in the war and informed Japanese intelligence, so that Japan had a very clear analysis. So the intelligence and the planning and the organization gave Japan a big lead, and they won. Now, in my book, Think About the Broad History, there was one time when the Japanese just remade their culture as a result of China. And there were two times when China did a tremendous amount learning from Japan. And they're both in this period from 1895 up to through 2008, 2010. And the first period, of course, was just after the Japanese, Sino-Japanese War. There's a woman named Paula Harrell, who had done a wonderful amount of research on this topic and published a couple books. And she and I became friends, and she was kind enough to work with me in writing one chapter on that period, where she had done so much basic research, and I brought some of the broad picture of what the two countries were doing at that time. And so one chapter of my book really draws on her wonderful research in describing this period of studying studying Japan. When the Japanese were studying China from 600 to 838, they sent organized missions. And they were planned every 15, 20 years. They would send a group and they were organized and had specific topics. In this period after 1895, there were some Chinese government groups who went there to Japan to do organized studies of educational system and business system. But the basic learning that occurred during that time came from individuals who, after the examination system was beginning to fall apart in the late 1890s and did fall apart and ended in 1905, they were thinking about their future. And it wasn't at all clear to a lot of bright young Chinese who were ambitious, whose families wanted to help them, what they should do, but they wanted to learn about the world, and they could see they had to know a lot about modernization. So at the time, it was much more costly to go to Europe than to go to Japan. And besides, Japan had written language that was close enough to Chinese that they could learn it pretty quickly. And a lot of the key books about European modernization were available in Japanese. So for bright young Chinese and their families who wanted to send them for better education, they were sending them overwhelmingly to Japan, from China to Japan. And there have been various estimates. There are no precise figures. Some people estimate that maybe 10,000 at the time of the Sino, at the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. There were as many as 10,000 or even more students from China in Japan. Far more foreign students than were in any country, any place else in the world, were Chinese in Japan. And they were studying all kinds of things. One of the most famous, of course, was Lu Xun, the famous Chinese writer who went to study medicine in the northeast Tohoku area, what is now Tohoku University Medical School. And he went to that medical school, but when he saw pictures in the Russo-Japanese War of Chinese, he could see that China was so far behind. He felt that his role was to wake people up, and so he decided to become a novelist. Well, in terms of Chinese literature, it wasn't just Lu Xun. Mao Dun, another famous writer of the period, Yu Dafu, later Guo Moro. The Chinese literary scene of the 1920s, modern literature, was basically led by people who had studied in Japan. And they had studied different places and they discovered different ideas, but they had learned literature and were writing about modern topics in a way the Japanese were, that really shaped the growth of modern literature. But if you look in the military, one of the people who went to Japan to do the military was Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek had gone there fairly early in the 1900s and gone to Japanese National Military Academy. And not only Chiang Kai-shek, but a lot of other people. One of my favorites that I read about is a military leader named Zhang Baili. In 1906, at the National Japanese Military Academy, the person who graduated first in the class was not Japanese, he was Chinese. His name was Zhang Baili. And he became friendly with a lot of the Japanese military leaders. In the 1920s and early 30s, he could see, he kept good contact with them and they liked him at a personal level, had very good relationship with his classmates. He could see that Japan was planning to invade China. And he could see that China needed to get ready for that. But he could also see there was no way they could match the organization and the military equipment and the speed that Japan could do. And they were going to lose out. They were going to be, when the Japan invaded, they would invade lots of places. What should China do? It should engage in a protracted war. It should pull them in and wear them out. And finally, when they were worn out, that would be victory. Mao later wrote an article on protracted war, but the person who thought of, or who popularized the idea in China was Zheng Baili before Mao did that. And he also became an advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. So the basic strategy of China pulling out from the east, going west. What happened during the World War II, of course, was that the Japanese wore themselves out. The Russians invaded in a place called Nomonhan and defeated them. And then when they became Japanese, invaded, bombed Pearl Harbor and began invading Southeast Asia, they were overstretched. And so by 1942-43, Japan was not able to finish conquering all of China, and they were basically stymied. That's when Chiang Kai-shek went to Chongqing and the nationalists, and they waited out. And they basically followed the Zheng Baili strategy, protracted war, and then won the war at the end. So in literature and in military, they learned from Japan. But in the realm of ideas, they also learned from Japan. If you look at the words for socialism or communism, those words in Chinese, in socialism, 社会主义, where did that come from? Sakai-shi. It came from a Japanese writer named Kawakami Hajime, a leftist, communist-oriented writer at Kyoto University, who translated a lot of basic books about Marxism, introduced those things. And so the Chinese who were involved in thinking about their future or kind of political organization, they learned about socialism, communism. The word communism in Kyosanshi in Japanese, Gongshandang in Chinese, those words came from Japanese, from Kawakami Hajime. So I remember in China one time, somebody said, that's the Julabu. Julabu, what the hell is a Julabu? Well, that was from the characters, Japanese characters mean kurabu, meant club. And when the Japanese used characters for kurabu in Chinese, it would be julabu. So those terminology and the thinking, the introduction of ideas like socialism, communism came from Japan. So it had an extraordinary impact. As I say, the Japanese didn't sufficiently apologize for World War II, but the Chinese didn't sufficiently thank the Japanese for all they learned. And another way to put it is nationalism in the two countries became quite strong, and sort of rise of Japanese, Chinese in the May 4th movement and so forth. With nationalism, they didn't want to emphasize too much that that pipsqueak country over there was a place they learned a lot of things, but in fact they did. And so that period of the 1895 up through 1941 or so, 1937, I guess you could say, as a good cutting point, when the Japanese study in Japan basically ended. That period, the Chinese learned a tremendous amount. Then comes World War II, and all the horrible things you read about. There's no question there's a lot of truth. A lot of the Japanese behaved very badly. There's just too many movies and signs of the horrible things they did, and too many written memories to deny. Although a lot of Japanese don't like to talk about those things. So in the case of Japanese nationalism, they don't like to emphasize all the horrible things they did to China in World War II. Now, there were 3 times I said that one country really learned a lot from the other. One, as I mentioned, 600 to 838 Japanese learned from China. This period after 1895 up to 1937, the Chinese learned a tremendous amount from Japan. The third period began shortly after 1978. After World War II, Japan and China had very little contact. The first 3 or 4 years, of course, while the Chinese Civil War was still going, there were a lot of Japanese who were stranded in Manchuria and other places, and who had difficulty coming home. And then they finally, a lot of them died. Some were in Russian camps. And so the Japanese really had retreated. After 49, during the occupation led by the United States, a lot of the Japanese wanted to resume that commercial context. They felt that Japan was too small. The industrial area they had developed was in Manchuria. They had felt they were dependent on China for crops, for wheat and other edible things that they use in their diet. And so they wanted to resume that. But MacArthur and the Americans said no. This was part of the Cold War. China was allied with the Soviet Union. It was Red China in those days. And so the American occupation did not allow a lot of contact. And there was very little contact between China and Japan in the first years of the occupation. Then you come to 1971. 1971, Kissinger flies to China. For some time, we had been reassuring Japan that we would not begin to have contacts with China without first consulting Japan. And so we were quite sure about that. And Sato Eisaku, who was the prime minister in Japan at the time, and Nixon were having some squabbles over the textile issues. And so there wasn't very good communication, and Kissinger and Nixon were not on very good terms with Sato Eisaku. But then suddenly in 71, Kissinger flies to Beijing, and he doesn't tell the Japanese. He promised them that he would, but he didn't. And he felt, and Nixon felt, that if they let the Japanese know, it would leak out that the nationalists in Taiwan would pressure Congress and it wouldn't work out, and that he had to do it secretly. So he did. And so the Japanese felt very betrayed in 71 when they found out that Kissinger had gone to Beijing without them. So what did they do? They felt they had to move very quickly and improve relations. At the time, Sato Eisaku, the prime minister, had such bad relations with China that it was clear that he wasn't going to be able to make much progress. Within a few months, the Japanese elected a new prime minister who had promised that he would do a lot to have better relations with China. That's Tanaka Coughlin. So within a few weeks of his selection as prime minister, he flew to Beijing and went further than the United States, even normalizing relations. He rushed so quickly to normalize relations that a lot of the details, like where the consulate's going to be and how we're going to set up people at the ports to go through the goods and so forth, all those things had not been settled. But some Japanese business people thought that if they didn't move quickly, the Americans were going to get the march on uh, business and take over the Chinese market before the Japanese got there. So they wanted to move quickly. So Tanaka Coughlin moved quickly, normalized relations in 1972. It took the United States right up till 1979 before we were more normalized relations, but Japan jumped quickly. However, they weren't able to develop very big relationships with China because China was still fighting the Cultural Revolution. Things were in a wild state. But in 1978, it was clear that Deng Xiaoping was going to have some big responsibilities. And in December 1978, at the third plenum, he took over and began to remake China into modernization. But before he went to, before he had the third plenum that set the new thing, he took two visits. One was to Southeast Asia, to Singapore and other places, to try to get the help of overseas Chinese business people who might help investing in China as it tried to begin the course of modernization. The other place Deng Xiaoping visited was Japan. So he came to power, as I said, in December 78. October 78, he went to Japan. He already had a very clear idea of the kind of industry and the kind of help he wanted from Japan. One of the places he visited was a place, a steel plant. New Japan Steel was very modern, probably the world's best steel plant, was Kimitsu on the bay of Tokyo Bay. He visited that steel plant. And that steel plant became the model for Baoshan Steel, the first modern steel plant in China. In addition to that, he wanted to get on electronics. Of course, in those days, they didn't have computers, but they were beginning to introduce calculating machines and the TV and other electronic equipment. And the best place, perhaps in the world, but one of the 2 or 3 best places, was Matsushita Konosuke, who was in Osaka. And ran National, Panasonic, all those names were organized by Matsushita. So Deng went down to visit Matsushita in Osaka. While he was on the trail, he went on the Shinkansen. In those days, China had no modern railway. Now, as you know, they have about as much modern railway as the whole world. But the first time a Chinese leader rode on a modern high-speed rail was when Deng was on the Shinkansen in 1978. Another place he visited was a Nissan steel plant, automobile plant, which had robots. Nissan was interesting because it had developed in China's northeast in Manchuria in those days and played a role in Manchuria. But they were beginning to make modern autos. And so those 4 places became models of what Deng wanted to get from Japan. And Japan did help in all those areas. And it was partly that they felt guilty. Chiang Kai-shek had signed agreements so they didn't have to pay reparations. But they wanted to get into the Chinese market, and they figured that they owed China something, and if they were helpful in giving money and teaching, that they would be able to form better relations with China and begin to develop the Chinese market. And so JETRO, part of Japan's bureaucracy, foreign trade promotion, external trade organization, sent a lot of people. The Chinese would request training in XYZ, and JETRO would cooperate. So in the next 1980s, Japan played an enormous role in getting industry started. They gave more money than other countries, more than the United States. They sent more technicians. And so in terms of a lot of the basics of industry, it was that China was learning in Japan. Well, after that went on for some years, um, and after the 1989, the May 4th incident, most countries didn't want to have anything to do with China for a few years. But among the countries in the world, the modern country that was most willing to resume contact was Japan. So they had a pretty good relationship between China and Japan that continued through 92. After 1992, Deng felt that the youth of China, having caused the June 4th problem, that they ought to have better training, better education in patriotism. So he started a patriotic education campaign. And when Japanese thought of what they could do effectively to get patriotic youth, the simplest thing was the anti-Japanese war, because there were a lot of memories of the cruelties. And it wasn't hard to have a lot of people tell those stories of how cruel the Japanese were. And they used modern techniques of propaganda, the movies. And the movies of Japanese in World War II, there was one year when they made actually 100 new movies on the Japanese War. It wasn't only that the government said, please make movies. A lot of private companies by that time could see that in the moods, things were beginning to be popular. And so they made movies. Some of them were thrown together very quickly and were not things that the Chinese first-class movie directors were proud of, but it was very popular. And so the anti-Japanese feelings came out very strong, and patriotism. And those patriotic feelings underlay the change of power that took place in 2010 to 12. Now, as I look at what happened in 2010 to 12, it was partly the results of those patriotic education campaign, but it was also a turning point. China had felt that from 1895, basically they had to bow down to the Japanese. Even the Japanese businessmen came with their satchels. There was a kind of arrogance in teaching. They were helping the Chinese, but they were on top. And to a lot of Chinese who were proud of their history, that wasn't the way things ought to do. So in this period of 2010 to 12, in my interpretation, a lot of the underlying sentiment of the Chinese was, damn it, we've bowed down to you too long, and now we're on top. And so after 2010, the Chinese were on top. And now the two countries have been trying to develop a new kind of relationship. It was very antagonistic. And now they're trying to get things under control in a new condition. So that's my very quick overview of this period from 1895 to 2010, the period when Japan was on top. And now we're back to the long historical period when the Chinese are on top under very different historical conditions. Thanks, Lynn. Bye-bye.